Hello, I'm Dickie Arbiter in London.
And I'm Victoria Arbiter in New York, and you're watching Royal Report. Remembrance Week is undoubtedly one of the most important weeks on the royal calendar. On Thursday, Queen Camilla attended the Field of Remembrance ceremony outside Westminster Abbey, where she placed a cross adorned with a poppy in memory to the fallen. Last night, members of the royal family were at the Royal Albert Hall for the annual Festival of Remembrance, this year marking 80 years since the Battle of the Atlantic and the 70th anniversary of the Korean War. And today, the King led the National Service of Remembrance at the Cenotaph on Whitehall. The origins of Remembrance Sunday harken back to Armistice Day 1919, when mourners gathered around war memorials around the country and processions featuring dignitaries and veterans were held in honour of the Armistice Treaty, which was signed just a year earlier, marking the end of hostilities and World War I. The armistice was signed on the 11th of November 1918, and it took effect at 11 o'clock in the morning, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. In May 1919, Australian journalist Edward George Honey wrote to the London Evening Post, and in his letter, which was subsequently published, he suggested that the nation hold a respectful silence in honour of the fallen. The idea was brought to the attention of King George V, who embraced it enthusiastically. And on the 7th of November 1919, a message was published by the London Times from the King in which he said, "All locomotion should cease, so that in perfect stillness the thoughts of everyone may be concentrated on reverent remembrance of the glorious dead." In the years since, the silence has been held at 11 a.m. on the 11th of November in memory to those who made the ultimate sacrifice. Now, in 1945, government ministers of the day met to discuss how Armistice Day should be commemorated moving forwards. Many felt that because it was on the 11th of November, only those who perished in World War I would be remembered, and they were worried that those who gave up their lives in World War II might be forgotten. A number of dates were thrown around, but it was the Archbishop of Westminster who finally came forward and said, "How about we hold it on the second Sunday in November?" Thus was born Remembrance Sunday, and in the years since, it has really provided a rare moment of national unity. Now, Dad, I remember being very small and accompanying you out of necessity more than anything. We didn't have a babysitter to Remembrance Sunday when you were commentating for LBC. Later, of course, working at Buckingham Palace, you were very much aware of the family's plans from behind the scenes. But there was one word that always stuck out in my memory of you using with the late Queen, and you said that for her, Remembrance Sunday in particular was sacrosanct. Why was that?
It was sacrosanct for a number of reasons. Her father was in the Battle of the Atlantic during the First World War. The Great War is what it was called. The war to end all wars, but it didn't. He was aboard HMS Collingwood as a midshipman. He did have asthma and various other things, ailments, and eventually he was pulled off the ship. But he fought in the North Atlantic. Her husband, the late Prince Philip, fought in the Mediterranean theatre of war, also in the Far East theatre. And she put on uniform, joined the Women's Royal Army Corps at the latter end of the war in 1945. So there was a lot to it that was very important to her. It was important to her father that Remembrance Sunday happened. It was important to her. You've got to remember that other members of the family, Lord Louis Mountbatten was Supreme Allied Commander in the Far East. So there is a connection. And last year, when late Queen died, she was the last head of state to have served in World War II. So Remembrance Sunday was sacrosanct. It was unfortunate in 2017, I think it was, if my memory serves me correctly, that she actually stopped laying a wreath. The family felt it was too risky for her at 91 to walk backwards down the plinth, having laid her wreath. And thereafter she watched it from a balcony in the Foreign Office. It was very, very important to her. And it's very important to the current royal family as well, and really to the British people and Commonwealth. And that is why thousands gather in Whitehall every year. As you remember, as a little girl watching from the second floor window of I think it was called Juxon House, overlooking the Cenotaph. Below us was the BBC commentator. We were slightly higher up. You had a commanding view of everything. And you knew exactly what was going on. I didn't have to explain to you. You knew about the 2-minute silence. You knew about the prayers. You knew about the wreath laying. You knew about the veterans marching past. And you even knew the regiments. And I think your favourite was the Royal Marines.
I did. I always loved the Royal Marines. And to this day, I mean, I love a marching band, but I think it never fails to be incredibly moving. Of course, watching the National Service of Remembrance, but then it's the Veterans March Past that just sort of gives you goosebumps every time. But we are going to jump to the King and his role and how it is equally important to him, as you mentioned, to commemorate the fallen on Remembrance Sunday. But just sticking with the Queen for a moment, I thought this was remarkable that actually throughout her reign, she only missed the service at the Cenotaph on very few occasions. There was the time she was pregnant with Andrew and Edward. There were 4 other occasions when she was overseas. And then very sadly in 2021, she had every intention of being there, but she had a sprained back. And so Buckingham Palace announced that very sadly she wouldn't be there. But I'm so glad you touched on this, Dad, that she was the last remaining head of state to have served in uniform at the time of her death. And there is a wonderful story, again, as you said, that she was part of the Women's Auxiliary Service during the war. She'd really had to beg her parents to allow her to sign up, but she wanted to do her bit. And there's this story about how she was training out at the Camberley Army Depot, and part of the training required her to drive a big heavy vehicle into London to complete her training. And she had been told, absolutely not, under any circumstances are you going to be allowed to do that. And I think perhaps it was one of the rare instances where she just did what she wanted, and she went against all the advice. Not only did she drive that heavy truck by herself into London, she navigated Hyde Park Corner, which in those days didn't have traffic lights. I think she went around Piccadilly Circus, eventually coming up the Mall and then through the entrance gates to Buckingham Palace, where there were a team of horrified ministers waiting for her, all of whom were just relieved that she had made it in one piece. But I think it speaks to the Queen's dedication to duty, because of course you mentioned she was the wife and the daughter of former serving officers, but her son also, King Charles, he certainly trained with all 4 branches of the military. Prince Harry saw combat in Afghanistan. And so this is a family who has long ties to the armed forces, not to mention the fact that the monarch is the head of the British Armed Forces as well. So I think it's very poignant when we see this continuity, because we talk about George V being there and approving of this 2-minute silence. He was also there for the unveiling of the Cenotaph in 1920, and he was there for the burial of the unknown soldier when the body was brought from northern France and interred in Westminster Abbey. And so that's another element to the royal family that you sort of talked about a lot when I was growing up, Dad, and that was continuity. And it's remarkable to think of the number of monarchs that have not only marked this occasion, but that have stood at the Cenotaph in respectful silence.
It is remarkable that there is that continuity. That is part of the British continuity, certainly within the realms of monarchy. What is quite interesting, the very first cenotaph was a temporary structure. It was made of wood, plaster and canvas, and it went up, and so moved were people seeing it. They laid wreaths for days afterwards, and it was an article in the Times that suggested perhaps something should be more permanent. So Edwin Lutyens, a very famous architect, designed the original temporary structure, and he designed what we see today. And it did go up very quickly. It's made of Portland stone, and it is a symbol. It is a symbol of us remembering, whether it's First or Second World War or Korean War, but subsequent conflicts where British service personnel and Commonwealth have been involved in since it was first opened and unveiled in 1920. It's a very important day. It's an important day to everybody. What is quite interesting is that yesterday which was the 11th of November, the actual anniversary of Armistice Day, and people actually stood for 2 minutes silence. They just stopped in their tracks in the streets. They started that again. The government suggested it quite a few years ago. It was slow to take up. But I remember as a kid, I was born in 1940, and very formative years, very impressionable years. And I remember as a kid that you'd walk through the streets of London, and come 11 o'clock on the 11th of November, irrespective of which day of the week it was, buses would stop, drivers would clamber out of their buses, taxi drivers would clamber out of their cabs, lorry drivers would stand by their trucks. People would actually stop in their tracks in the street to observe 2 minutes silence. That doesn't happen today, but people do stop in the street for 2 minutes silence. I'm not saying everybody, but a lot of people do stop in the street, and that's still good to see. So it's not only on the 11th of November, whatever day of the week it is, but it's also on Remembrance Sunday. Thousands watching it in Whitehall, tens of thousands watching it on television, because it is broadcast live. It is broadcast globally. And it is something that we should remember, that those who laid down their lives, not just in the First or Second World Wars, but subsequently, laid down their lives for king and country or queen and country, so that we may live free from tyranny, so that we may walk the streets safely, that today people say it's their right to demonstrate. Fine, they feel it's their right. And they couldn't have done that without the sacrifices made in all those conflicts. Over 800,000 British service personnel were killed, over 300,000 in the Second World War, 1.7 million killed from the Commonwealth services in both World Wars. So great sacrifice in order that we can live the way we live today, and we should not forget that.
I think for so many people, and not everyone, as you said, I don't want to generalize, but the cenotaph really is a symbol of unity as well. And one of the things that the late Queen in particular was credited with was her ability to extend the hands of friendship. She did it in Ireland during her trip there. She did it with a number of countries around the world, and a number of countries around the world have their own commemorative services to the fallen. We've been joined by the cat. But I think what was really quite striking was in 2018, when the German president was welcomed to lay a wreath at the cenotaph. That certainly hadn't happened ever. And I think that was really, would you say, because of the Queen, or would that have been a government move? Whoever's decision it was a poignant symbol of peace and continuity and unity.
The government would have invited to the country and would have approved the fact that the German president did lay a wreath, but the Queen would have had the final say. And it's all part and parcel of reconciliation. You know, what happened years ago happened years ago. We learn from what did happen to make sure that it doesn't happen again. Unfortunately, some of the things do happen, and there's no stopping it. But it's all about reconciliation, and the Queen was a past master at it.
Now, last night, talking about reconciliation, the Festival of Remembrance, which is an annual service that is held at the Royal Albert Hall, it never fails to elicit floods of tears from anyone watching, particularly at the end when there's the silence, which is followed by poppy petals falling from the ceiling. I mean, I've got goosebumps even just talking about it. It really is incredibly moving, and I think it really sets the tone ahead of Sunday. But we always see a massive turnout from members of the royal family. Last night was no exception. And this is put on by the Royal British Legion. And I don't think there is a charity in the United Kingdom that can boast such a strong connection to members of the royal family. Just this gives you a very small idea. But it was in 1923 that during a trip to Belgium, the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VIII, greeted members of the Royal British Legion's Brussels branch with an enthusiastic handshake and a group photo. 43 years later, his niece, Queen Elizabeth, met the Belgian veterans in the Grand Place when she commended their distinguished service. The Queen Mother was appointed president of the women's section in 1924. That's a role that Princess Anne went on to hold. Prince Philip regularly attended the Field of Remembrance at Westminster Abbey. Prince Harry took over for a short time before he opted to leave as a working royal, and Queen Camilla has since taken over. So the Royal British Legion is really there to support wounded veterans, widows and orphans of veterans who have lost their lives in whatever the conflict might be. And the enduring symbol of the Royal British Legion is the poppies that we are wearing. Now, I'm wearing one of the old school paper ones with the leaf is set to 11 o'clock. With the camera reversal, it may look like 1 o'clock, but I can assure you that it is set to 11 a.m., which is in commemoration of the armistice signed in 1918. Dad, you're wearing one of the newer ones, but yours is dated.
Yeah, I'm wearing one of the metal ones. It's a metal badge. They do cost about £5. I mean, a poppy donation is a donation. You can give what you like, but the metal ones, they do cost. They cost £5. I usually buy half a dozen and make a substantial donation to the Royal British Legion because I think it's important. They do a very important role. And each metal badge has the year date, so you can't get away with wearing last year's because people will see it. So this one says 2023 on it. The leaf is pointing at 11 o'clock, which is the way it should do. I mean, a lot of people don't know that, but so I hope they will learn about it today. And it's quite interesting how the poppy came about. We've got to remember part and parcel of the poppy becoming a remembrance symbol is Lawrence Binyon's poem To the Fallen, which he wrote after the British Expeditionary Force's first battle, the Battle of Arras, in which they lost something like 58,000 in 6 weeks. And he couldn't quite comprehend, and he wrote For the Fallen, and it is very poignant, and that is how the Festival of Remembrance finishes at the Royal Albert Hall, and finished last night, as it has done every night that it's been held since 1923. It's the we will remember them, and yes, we do remember them. And then is the sounding of the last post, and then 5,000 people in that hall sang the national anthem. And it's very moving. I mean, you, Victoria, said a few moments ago, it brings goosebumps. And I think it brings goosebumps to everybody who watches it, whether they're there or whether they're watching it on television. It's a very important occasion, important to the royal family, important to the people who are there, and I think important too to the people who are watching it at home.
Some people, as you mentioned earlier, people have a right to protest. They have a right to demonstrate. Of course, that's part of the freedoms that we are fortunate to enjoy today. But the symbolism behind the poppy is really quite poignant. And I wonder, those that say we shouldn't wear poppy, it's a symbol of war, perhaps don't understand sort of really where this idea came from. And it dates back to 1915, and the symbolism behind it is very poignant. A Canadian doctor, Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, lost a friend in action during World War I, and he noticed poppies growing on his freshly covered grave. And against the backdrop of war, that sight was really very poignant and very moving, and it inspired him to write In Flanders Field. And upon hearing that poem, an American academic, Moyna Michael, she began selling poppies to raise money for those returning servicemen. And it was in September 1921 that Madame Guerin, a French woman living in the US, she traveled to London and introduced the idea to the recently formed British Legion. And so that is sort of the journey of the poppy and why it is that we wear them today. Initially, a million poppies that were made by widows and orphans in France were sold. A further 8 million were then subsequently made in Britain. And they were timed to coincide with Remembrance Sunday. And so the first ever poppy appeal was launched. And in the years since, it's become the RBL's most significant fundraiser, and a very important one, because the money that they raise does go on to help all of those servicemen and women who perhaps don't have help from any other avenue. Going back to the late Queen, sort of, as you often used to say, Dad, she leads by example. She never used to like to tell people what to do. And I think partly in her role as a great grandmother and showing the future generations what to do. I think, what was it, in 2018, 2019, something like that, she and now King Charles and Prince William were joined by Prince George in the music room, which was turned into a bit of a makeshift kitchen at Buckingham Palace. And they were there it was an event to raise awareness of the Royal British Legion, but Prince George was given Christmas puddings to make that was subsequently going to be given away. And there he is stabbing at the Christmas pudding, and the the Queen beat a bit of a hasty retreat. I think she was a bit frightened of Christmas pudding going flying. But it was such a wonderful, enduring image to see 4 generations of royals there for a very poignant and significant reason. And it was perhaps Prince George's first introduction to his future role. And I think that's really what made the Queen so special in so many ways as well, that it was never about self. Talk about embodying the motto of the Royal British Legion. It was always others, and it was always duty before herself.
Yeah, and you know, sort of going back to the poppy, is people suggesting it's a symbol of war. It's not a symbol of war. It's a symbol because of war. That people wear it, and it is a symbol to remember. The late Queen, yes, she did lead by example. You are so right. I'd like to go back. You know, you mentioned earlier that she drove this truck from Aldershot into London. That's really where she learnt to drive. Now, I'd been in a car with her on several occasions. She was a good driver, and my goodness, was she a fast driver. She had a lead weight in her right foot. She didn't hold any quarter, whether it was in the Jag that she would use in town, or whether it was a Land Rover, Range Rover up at Balmoral. She knew the terrain, she knew where the potholes were, she knew what to avoid, but it didn't let up on the speed. I remember driving with her on one occasion, a journey that should have taken about 15 minutes took about 11. That just gives you some idea. But she was a very safe driver, and she was a very good driver. So that was one good thing that came out of her drive from Aldershot into London and into Buckingham Palace with this very heavy truck. But yes, she did lead by example. And I think what we're seeing today is we're seeing that the King is leading by example too, that he's going up and down the country. He's been on state visits abroad, which is for another edition, but he is leading by example. He had a good tutor. He learned from his mother. It was all rubbish, in fact, suggestions in the media that he didn't get on with his parents and his parents didn't love him and he didn't love his parents. He had a tremendous relationship with his parents, but at the end of the day, his parents had a job to do. In the same way, he had a job to do when he was married to Diana, which is why William and Harry didn't get the full attention of their parents, because duty came first. And even today, duty comes first.
I love that you referenced the fact actually there, Dad, about generations learning from previous generations, because as I touched on before, George V was there for the interment of the remains of the unknown warrior who was brought from northern France. He was there. He placed a wreath of red roses and bay leaves on the final resting place, and it has become a destination for so many people who can link their family history back to World War I and that they lost relatives. But a lovely tradition was started by the Queen Mother in 1923. Upon her wedding, she lay her bridal bouquet on the wreath of the unknown warrior. It was in tribute to her brother Fergus, who had died during World War I. She was then the only royal bride to ever walk down the aisle without her bridal bouquet in her hand. But in the years since, every royal bride has sent their bouquet back to be put on the tomb of the unknown warrior. And I think that as well speaks for the royal family's commitment to the armed services. It might be a small gesture, but it's one absolutely loaded with meaning. And so the Queen learnt from her parents as well, I think it's fair to say, what it means to honour those who have made the ultimate sacrifice.
It means a lot to honour the ultimate sacrifice, because as I said earlier, we wouldn't be here today if those people hadn't made that sacrifice. We saw in World War I, the Great War, the recruitment was swamped with people volunteering, wanting to take the King's shilling, as they called it in those days. They were swamped again in the Second World War. People made the ultimate sacrifice because there was a cause. There was a cause to fight for freedom, fight for life. Which is why we enjoy life today, because of those sacrifices made by those thousands who died in both those great wars.
An estimated 50 million people lost their lives in the Second World War alone. Our privileges are great, but our debts are even greater. And as Remembrance Week comes to an end with Remembrance Sunday, it's important that today and in the days, weeks, months and years ahead, particularly with the world in such a difficult place right now, it's important that we remember the pain they endured, the sacrifices they made. And Dad, you touched on earlier the words of English poet and dramatist Robert Lawrence Binyon, who once wrote, "They shall not grow old as they that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn." We'll see you next time on Royal Report.